Jacob Harrison, a 22-year-old college student, was struggling to find affordable housing near his university in Springfield. With the academic year rapidly approaching, he had no choice but to accept a room in an old, dilapidated house located on the edge of town. The house, though ancient and weathered, was incredibly cheap, far below the average rental prices in the area. Given his tight budget, Jacob decided it was his best option. The house itself stood in eerie isolation, its presence barely noticeable against the backdrop of overgrown weeds and tangled vines. The once grand structure now seemed to slump under the weight of decades, its paint peeling like old scars on its weather-beaten facade. As Jacob approached, he couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine, though he quickly dismissed it as nerves about his new living situation. Mr. Thompson, the elderly landlord, was a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a voice that trembled slightly as he spoke. His mannerisms were peculiar and unsettling, but Jacob attributed this to his old age and perhaps a lifetime of hard experiences. The old man handed Jacob the key to his room with a warning that seemed almost cryptic. "Just remember, young man," Mr. Thompson said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he pointed down the dimly lit hallway, "never open the door at the end of that corridor. It's been locked for a reason." Jacob looked down the corridor where the door in question stood, a heavy wooden barrier at the end of a long, dark passage. The door appeared old, its paint cracked and faded, and the lock was rusted and ancient. It seemed almost like an afterthought in the grand scheme of the house's decay. Jacob's curiosity was piqued, but he shrugged off the warning as an old man's superstition. As Jacob moved into his new room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the house. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, and an unsettling chill lingered in the air, no matter how high he turned up the heater. He did his best to settle in, unpacking his few belongings and trying to make the space feel like home. Despite his efforts, the presence of that locked door loomed large in his mind, a shadow that seemed to cast its own chill over the room. Late that night, as Jacob lay in bed, he found himself staring at the ceiling, the old house creaking and groaning around him. The warning from Mr. Thompson echoed in his thoughts. It was strange how a single door could invoke such a strong sense of foreboding. Still, Jacob convinced himself it was just an old man's way of adding a bit of mystery to his rent agreement. With a final sigh, he turned off the lamp and tried to focus on sleep, unaware that this seemingly mundane warning was the first thread in a web of terror that was about to ensnare him. As Jacob settled into his new living space, the peculiar atmosphere of the old house became increasingly apparent. The walls of the house were peeling and stained, with patches of mold creeping up in the corners. Every step he took on the creaky wooden floors seemed to resonate through the house, the groaning sounds amplified by the silence of the empty rooms. The air in the house was perpetually cold, as if the warmth from outside had never quite penetrated its decaying walls. Even during the day, the sunlight filtering through the grimy windows did little to dispel the chill. Jacob found himself wearing extra layers even while indoors, trying to stave off the constant, biting cold that seemed to seep into his bones. Jacob's room was small, with barely enough space for a bed, a desk, and a rickety old chair. Despite its cramped size, he tried to make it as cozy as possible. He arranged his books and personal items with care, attempting to create a semblance of comfort in the otherwise stark room. The only window in the room looked out onto a narrow alley, where overgrown vines clung to the brick walls of the neighboring buildings, adding to the overall sense of isolation. From his room, Jacob could see the old door at the end of the corridor. The door was a relic from another era, its wooden surface warped and cracked. The rusted lock seemed almost an afterthought, barely functional, but nonetheless imposing. It was an ominous presence at the end of the hallway, an unspoken challenge that seemed to beckon him with its quiet, sinister allure. Jacob tried to distract himself from the eerie atmosphere of the house by diving into his studies and keeping busy with various activities. He buried himself in textbooks and assignments, hoping that the routine would help him ignore the unsettling features of his new home. Despite his best efforts, the locked door remained a constant, nagging thought in the back of his mind. During his rare moments of relaxation, Jacob would find his gaze drifting down the hallway, fixating on the door. It stood there, unmoving and silent, yet somehow it seemed to pulse with a quiet, menacing energy. He often wondered what lay beyond it, but he quickly brushed off these thoughts as irrational fears. After all, Mr. Thompson's warning seemed like an overblown piece of local folklore designed to spook tenants. One evening, as Jacob was reading late into the night, he heard a faint, unsettling noise coming from the corridor. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something or someone was gently knocking on the door. His heart raced, and he stood still, listening intently. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving him in a thick silence that felt even more oppressive than before. Jacob's unease grew as the days passed. He found it increasingly difficult to focus on his studies or relax. The door's presence seemed to loom larger with each passing hour, and the cold, unwelcoming atmosphere of the house seemed to press in on him, filling every corner of his mind with an ever-present sense of dread. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of lectures and studying, Jacob was lying in bed, trying to wind down. The house was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the heating system. As he was about to drift off to sleep, a sudden noise broke the silence. A series of soft, rhythmic knocks coming from the direction of the hallway. Jacob's eyes snapped open, and he lay still, listening intently. The knocks continued, growing slightly louder and more insistent. It was as though someone, or something, was tapping gently but persistently on the old, locked door at the end of the corridor. Jacob's heart raced as he pushed himself out of bed and crept toward the door to investigate. He opened his bedroom door cautiously, the hallway stretching out before him in darkness. The faint light from the street lamps outside cast long, eerie shadows along the walls. Jacob made his way down the corridor, each step causing the wooden floor to groan beneath his feet. The knocking had stopped by the time he reached the end of the hallway, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. He stood in front of the door, staring at the rusty lock and the time-worn wood. The silence was almost deafening now, and Jacob felt a chill crawl up his spine. He reached out and placed his hand on the door, half expecting to feel something beyond it, something alive. But the door remained still and unyielding. Determined to find out what was causing the noise, Jacob tried the handle, but it was firmly locked. He knocked on the door himself, but there was no response, only the echo of his own rapping fading into the emptiness. After a few minutes, he turned back to his room, feeling a mixture of frustration and apprehension. The next morning, Jacob decided to confront Mr. Thompson about the strange noises. He found the old man in the small office off the entrance hall, sorting through a pile of paperwork. The landlord looked up with a weary expression as Jacob approached, his eyes shadowed with concern. "Mr. Thompson," Jacob began hesitantly, "last night, I heard knocking coming from the door at the end of the corridor. Did you hear anything?" Mr. Thompson's face darkened, and he seemed to withdraw into himself, his eyes avoiding Jacob's. After a long pause, he replied, "Ah, that door. The house has a complicated history, you see. Things happen here that can't always be explained. It's best not to get involved with the past." Jacob pressed on, "But what kind of history? Why is it so important to keep that door locked?" Mr. Thompson's expression grew even more troubled. He sighed deeply, as if burdened by a weight of unspoken knowledge. "Some things are better left alone. The door has been locked for a reason, and there are stories, things that happened a long time ago, that are best not stirred up. Just stay away from it." With that, Mr. Thompson's voice grew firmer, signaling the end of the conversation. Jacob was left with a growing sense of unease. The old man's vague and cryptic warnings only fueled his curiosity. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the door, and to the house's history, than Mr. Thompson was willing to share. Jacob's curiosity about the locked door began to consume him. Despite his attempts to focus on his studies and maintain a semblance of normalcy, his thoughts increasingly wandered to the mysterious barrier at the end of the corridor. The persistent sense of unease and the cryptic warning from Mr. Thompson only fueled his growing obsession. Determined to uncover the truth, Jacob embarked on a personal investigation into the history of the house. He spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers, historical records, and any information he could find about the house and its previous occupants. The library's musty smell and the creaky wooden floors seemed to echo the same eerie atmosphere as the house itself. Jacob discovered that the house had once belonged to the Whitaker family, who had mysteriously vanished without a trace several decades ago. The records were sparse and fragmented, but one recurring term stood out in various articles and reports: tragic event. The local newspapers had reported the Whitakers' disappearance as a major story at the time, but details were vague. Some articles mentioned strange occurrences leading up to their disappearance, such as inexplicable noises and a growing sense of dread among the family members. Others simply hinted at dark, unexplained happenings in the house. One particularly intriguing document was an old, yellowed newspaper clipping that Jacob found buried in the archives. It detailed a series of unsettling events leading up to the Whitakers' disappearance. Neighbors reported seeing strange lights in the windows and hearing unexplained noises at night. The article mentioned that the Whitakers had been seen trying to seal off one of the rooms in the house, an action that seemed to coincide with their final days before disappearing. Jacob's obsession with the door only grew as he delved deeper into the house's history. He found himself increasingly drawn to the idea of unlocking the door and discovering what was concealed behind it. The more he learned about the Whitaker family and the unsettling events surrounding their disappearance, the more convinced he became that opening the door was the key to understanding the house's dark past. Late one night, Jacob sat in his room with the dusty research papers spread out before him. His mind was racing with theories and possibilities. What if the door hid something crucial about the Whitaker family's fate? What if uncovering the truth could shed light on the mysterious events that had taken place? The locked door seemed to symbolize a boundary between him and the answers he sought. Unable to shake his growing obsession, Jacob began making plans to open the door. He knew it would be risky, but his determination overshadowed any lingering doubts. He spent days gathering tools, preparing for the task he had set for himself. As the day approached, his excitement mingled with a gnawing sense of dread. He couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that by opening the door, he might not just uncover the past, but also awaken something that had been buried for a long time. With each passing day, the door's presence felt more ominous, and Jacob's resolve to unlock it became stronger. He convinced himself that understanding the history behind the door was worth the risk, no matter what it might reveal. One cold, moonless night, Jacob's determination reached its peak. The weight of his obsession with the locked door had become unbearable, and he resolved to confront his fears head-on. Armed with a crowbar and a set of screwdrivers he had scavenged from a local hardware store, he prepared for what he hoped would be the ultimate revelation. The house was eerily quiet, its usual creaks and groans heightened by the silence of the night. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he approached the end of the corridor, the dim light from his flashlight casting flickering shadows along the walls. The locked door loomed before him, its aged wooden surface seeming to pulse with an unsettling energy. The lock, rusty and decrepit, seemed to taunt him with its defiance. Jacob set to work, carefully positioning the crowbar against the doorframe. The metal felt cold and heavy in his hands as he began to apply pressure. The sound of metal scraping against wood echoed through the corridor, a harsh, grinding noise that made Jacob's heart race. Each pull of the crowbar seemed to reverberate through the house, amplifying his mounting anxiety. After several tense minutes of effort, the lock finally gave way with a sharp, resonant snap. Jacob let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and slowly pushed the door open. It swung inward with a slow, sinister creak, revealing what lay beyond. The sight that met his eyes was both mesmerizing and chilling. The room beyond the door was preserved in a state of eerie perfection, as though it had been frozen in time. The air inside was colder than the rest of the house, carrying a faint musty odor that mingled with the scent of aged wood and dust. The room was furnished with antique pieces, an old four-poster bed with intricately carved posts, a large, ornate wardrobe, and a writing desk covered in a fine layer of dust. Each piece of furniture was meticulously covered, but the thick dust on the surfaces suggested that no one had touched them for decades. A faded rug lay in the center of the floor, its colors muted, but still visible under the dim light. Jacob stepped cautiously into the room, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath his feet. His flashlight beam danced across the room, revealing delicate, moth-eaten curtains hanging at the windows and framed portraits on the walls. Portraits of the Whitaker family, their eyes seeming to follow him with an unsettling gaze. As Jacob moved further inside, he noticed a small, leather-bound journal resting on the desk. The book's cover was cracked and worn, but it was otherwise intact. His heart pounded with anticipation as he reached out to pick it up, the dust falling away with the motion. The journal was filled with handwritten notes and entries, and Jacob's hands trembled as he opened it. The first few pages were filled with mundane observations and personal reflections, but as he turned further, the entries grew darker and more troubled. The writing detailed the family's increasing fear of an unseen presence, strange occurrences in the house, and the gradual disintegration of their sanity. The final entries were frenzied and fragmented, describing the writer's desperate attempts to understand the malevolent force they believed was haunting them. Jacob's skin prickled as he read the final lines, which seemed to imply that the room had been a last refuge from whatever terror had beset the Whitaker family. The journal's final entry was a hurried scrawl, mentioning something locked away in the room. Darkness that must never be released. With the room's chilling atmosphere weighing heavily on him, Jacob's resolve began to waver. The air seemed to grow colder, and he felt an almost tangible presence in the room, as if the very walls were alive with the echoes of the past. The discovery of the journal only deepened his unease, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line that should never have been breached. As the night wore on, Jacob's fascination with the room began to turn to dread. The perfect preservation of the room, the eerie atmosphere, and the ominous warnings in the journal all combined to create a sense of foreboding that he could not ignore. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and Jacob knew that he had to confront whatever lay hidden in the shadows of the Whitaker house. Jacob's flashlight beam cast long shadows across the room as he began to thoroughly explore the eerie space. His gaze lingered on the faded, ornate wallpaper and the dust-covered furniture, each detail adding to the room's sense of foreboding. The journal he had found lay open on the desk, its pages yellowed with age, but Jacob's attention was drawn to something else now, an old trunk positioned near the bed. With mounting apprehension, Jacob approached the trunk and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, he discovered old clothing and personal items, all coated in a thick layer of dust. Among these belongings, he found a small, leather-bound journal tucked underneath a faded quilt. The journal appeared worn but was otherwise intact, its cover embossed with a floral design that was barely discernible. Jacob's hands shook as he opened the journal. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, each entry capturing the thoughts and fears of the journal's owner, a young woman named Emily Whitaker. The entries began innocuously enough, with Emily describing her daily life and interactions with her family. But as Jacob read on, the tone of the entries grew darker and more frantic. Emily wrote about a series of unsettling events that began shortly after the family moved into the house. She described hearing strange noises at night, soft, echoing whispers and unidentifiable scratching sounds. These noises were accompanied by inexplicable cold spots throughout the house, which seemed to follow her as she moved from room to room. Emily's writing conveyed a growing sense of paranoia and dread, as if she was constantly being watched by an unseen presence. One particularly chilling entry detailed a night when Emily had woken to find a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. The figure was described as a dark, formless shape with glowing eyes, and Emily recounted how she had been paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. The figure's presence seemed to grow stronger over time, and Emily noted that her family members began experiencing similar terrifying encounters. The journal's entries became increasingly disjointed and desperate. Emily wrote about how the entities seemed to feed off their fear, growing stronger and more malevolent with each passing day. She described the family's growing isolation from the outside world as they became consumed by their own terror. The entity, Emily believed, was not merely haunting them but was actively trying to drive them to madness. The final entries were particularly unsettling. Emily wrote about her attempts to protect her family from the entity, including her decision to seal off one of the rooms, the very room Jacob was now standing in. Her handwriting was frantic and scrawled, as if she had been in a state of panic. The last few sentences were barely legible, but they mentioned her plan to trap the entity within the room, hoping that by doing so, she could contain its malevolence and keep it from harming anyone else. Jacob's heart raced as he read the final lines of the journal. Emily's desperate attempt to confine the entity within the room seemed to confirm his worst fears. The room, once a place of eerie preservation, now felt like a prison, a containment chamber for something dark and sinister that had been waiting for decades. A cold sweat broke out on Jacob's forehead as he realized the gravity of what he had uncovered. The journal's revelations painted a grim picture of the house's history and the malevolent force that had plagued the Whitaker family. The feeling of dread that had been simmering in the back of his mind now surged to the forefront, filling him with an almost paralyzing sense of fear. As the shadows in the room grew longer and the oppressive silence deepened, Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding. The entity that Emily had tried to contain was no longer just a distant, theoretical threat. It was a palpable, looming presence that Jacob could almost feel pressing in on him. He knew that by opening the door, he had unleashed something that had been held at bay for far too long, and the consequences of his actions were becoming all too clear. With trembling hands, Jacob closed the journal and placed it gently back in the trunk. He stood in the center of the room, the weight of Emily's words heavy on his shoulders. The room seemed to close in around him, and he could almost hear the whispers of the past echoing through the oppressive darkness. In the days following his discovery of Emily's journal, Jacob's life began to unravel as he experienced a series of increasingly disturbing phenomena. The once faint unease that had lingered in the house now surged into a full-blown nightmare. The air in the house felt heavier, thick with a sense of impending doom that Jacob could not shake. It started with whispers, soft, indecipherable murmurs that seemed to float through the walls of his room at night. The sounds were disorienting, like a distant conversation held just out of reach. Jacob would wake in the dead of night, heart pounding, to find his room in complete darkness, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. The whispers grew louder and more insistent with each passing night, forming a low, eerie chorus that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Shadows began to move independently of their sources. One evening, as Jacob sat at his desk, he noticed a shadow darting across the wall behind him, despite there being no one else in the room. He turned around, but the shadow vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The experience left him unnerved, but he tried to rationalize it as a trick of the light or a figment of his imagination. However, the phenomena continued, becoming more frequent and more unsettling. The house's atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The cold that had once been a mere discomfort now felt like a biting chill that seeped into Jacob's very bones. No matter how high he turned up the heat, the house remained frigid, the cold seeming to have a life of its own. At night, the oppressive cold intensified, making it difficult for Jacob to sleep. His nightmares became vivid and horrifying. He would dream of being trapped in dark, claustrophobic spaces with shadowy figures closing in around him. The dreams were always accompanied by the same whispers he heard at night, growing louder and more frantic as he struggled to escape. Waking up drenched in sweat, Jacob would often find himself disoriented and fearful, unable to shake the lingering terror of his dreams. Jacob's waking hours were no better. He constantly felt as though he was being watched, an ever-present sensation of unseen eyes following his every move. The feeling was so intense that he would often turn around abruptly, expecting to find someone, or something, standing behind him. But there was never anyone there. The culmination of these experiences came one evening when Jacob returned to his room after a particularly exhausting day. As he entered, the temperature seemed to drop sharply. His breath became visible in the icy air, and the whispering grew louder, almost like a cacophony of voices overlapping each other. The shadows on the walls danced wildly, their movements erratic and disturbing. Jacob's eyes were drawn to the old mirror on the wall, which had been covered in dust since he moved in. As he approached, he noticed that the surface of the mirror was covered in strange, faintly glowing markings that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. The symbols appeared to be a form of writing or glyphs, but their meaning was elusive and incomprehensible. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a single, chilling voice, deep and guttural, resonating with a malevolent undertone. The voice seemed to emanate from the very walls, and Jacob felt a shiver of pure terror as it spoke. It was not a voice he could understand, but its tone conveyed a sense of overwhelming hatred and anger. In a panic, Jacob grabbed his flashlight and shone it around the room, trying to dispel the shadows and silence the whispers. But the more he tried to confront the darkness, the more intense the sensations became. The room seemed to close in around him, and the oppressive presence felt almost tangible. The entity Emily had written about seemed to be growing stronger, its influence more pronounced. Jacob could no longer ignore the fact that the malevolent force he had unwittingly unleashed was not only real but also becoming increasingly active and aggressive. The experiences of the past few days had shattered his sense of reality, leaving him with a pervasive sense of dread and a growing fear that he was no longer in control of his own environment. With the terror mounting and the entity's presence growing more palpable, Jacob realized that he needed to confront the situation head-on. He knew that if he was to have any hope of understanding or escaping the force that had been unleashed, he would have to face it directly, regardless of the cost. Jacob's growing terror drove him to seek help, convinced that Mr. Thompson might have some way to address the malignant force that had been unleashed. His mind was clouded with desperation and fear as he raced downstairs to find the old landlord, hoping that the man might have answers or a way to contain the entity once more. Finding Mr. Thompson in his dimly lit office, Jacob burst in without knocking. The old man looked up from his desk with a mixture of surprise and resignation, his expression growing more somber as he took in Jacob's frantic demeanor. "Mr. Thompson, you have to help me," Jacob pleaded, his voice trembling. "The entity, it's real. It's tormenting me, and I don't know how to stop it. Please, you have to do something." Mr. Thompson's gaze hardened, and he slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "I see you found out what was meant to be discovered," he said quietly, his tone almost reflective. "The house was never just an old building. It was a vessel for something far darker. I knew the entity would be released eventually. It was only a matter of time." Jacob's heart sank. "You knew? Why didn't you warn me? Why let this happen?" Mr. Thompson's voice took on a cold, detached quality. "The entity had been sealed for decades. I was waiting for someone to open the door, to release it. It's part of an old pact, a way to contain the darkness within these walls. You've played your part now." Jacob's desperation turned to panic. "No, I have to fix this. I need to find a way to lock the door again, to stop it." Mr. Thompson's eyes betrayed no hint of sympathy. "You can't undo what's been done. The door can't be locked from the outside once it's been opened. The entity is free now, and there's nothing you can do." With a newfound sense of urgency, Jacob rushed back to the corridor. He grabbed any tool he could find and attempted to force the door shut, but it was futile. The door, once opened, remained stubbornly ajar, the lock now broken beyond repair. The oppressive atmosphere in the house grew heavier, the whispers growing louder and more menacing as if they were mocking his efforts. In a last-ditch attempt to escape, Jacob sprinted to the front door, wrenching at the handle with all his strength. His heart pounded as he realized it was locked, bolted shut from the outside. Frantically, he tried the windows, only to find that they, too, were securely locked and sealed. The reality of his entrapment began to sink in, and a primal terror gripped him. The house seemed to close in on him, the walls almost pulsating with an unnatural energy. The air was thick with a suffocating darkness that seemed to emanate from every corner of the house. The whispers transformed into a chorus of eerie, guttural voices, each one more sinister than the last. Jacob turned back to the corridor, his flashlight flickering as he moved. The darkness at the end of the hallway seemed to deepen, and he felt an overwhelming presence drawing nearer. The oppressive darkness began to fill the room, spreading like ink spilled in water, consuming everything in its path. Jacob's breathing grew ragged as he stumbled back toward the room with the unlocked door. The shadows seemed to swirl around him, and the cold grew even more intense. The darkness moved with a sentient quality, as if it were deliberately pursuing him. He could feel the malevolent force closing in, its presence nearly palpable. As Jacob approached the open door, he was met with a wall of pure darkness that seemed to pulse with an eerie, malevolent rhythm. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and the air was charged with an almost unbearable weight. His last moments were filled with a blinding terror as the darkness enveloped him, his screams swallowed by the overwhelming force. The final sound that echoed through the house was Jacob's desperate, strangled cry, gradually fading as the entity claimed its final victim. The house fell silent once more, the only evidence of Jacob's struggle being the faint, lingering whispers of the entity, now fully at home in the darkness it had long awaited. And so, the cycle began anew, the house returning to its eerie stillness, waiting for the next unwitting soul to awaken the darkness locked within its walls.